Welcome to DIY Salvation, home to the resolution of the mind, also known as TROM, on YouTube. This presentation is best studied while viewing a copy of the Postulate Failure Cycle Chart. You can find such in the book TROM 2023, which you can download for free from this video's description. If you are listening while working out, driving, or engaged in some other activity, then have no worries. Listen now and study the chart later. What is the postulate failure cycle? Let's start with the word postulate. A postulate is a desire, intention, purpose, or goal. It's a causative consideration. You think it, and you want to make it happen. That's what we mean by a causative consideration. You think or say something like, I must get that promotion. I want that new car. I desire that beautiful woman. These are all examples of postulates. Postulates can succeed, postulates can fail, or postulates can get caught up in struggles with other postulates that oppose them. Postulates in opposition are called games. The game can be as trivial as hide and seek or as serious as war. Postulates succeed, fail, then change in an exact order. This we call the postulate failure cycle. I'll explain this cycle by first telling a story, then use the postulate failure cycle theory to explain it. A boy finds a frog. He shows it to his sister, who threatens to tell the mother that he brought a frog into the house if he doesn't get rid of it right away. As the boy leaves, his father sees the boy is hiding something in his hands. He asks what it is and the boy continues to walk away. Then the father grabs the boy's arms and the frog jumps out of his hands, and the mother scolds the boy. The boy, angry at the father for exposing his little secret, exposes the father. He goes to the father's computer and discovers naughty photos on it, then tells the mother. The father now distrusts the boy. He password protects his computer and keeps his office locked. The boy, seeing that his father is distancing himself, decides to ignore him. The father doesn't like being ignored, so starts yelling at the boy. The boy yells back at the father. He yells at the mother. He yells at his teacher. He yells so loudly and so often that sometimes they have to remove him from class at school or send him to his room when he's at home. He not only gets used to being in his room alone, but eventually prefers being alone. He wants privacy. He locks his door when he is sent to his room. One day his father gets fed up with the boy not coming when he is called and keeping his door locked. He kicks the door down, then takes it off the hinges, robbing the boy of his precious privacy. The boy gets back at his father for this by stealing the key to his office, breaking in and finding a bottle of liquor which he shows to the mother, who now gets further upset with the father, who now distances himself more from the boy, until the boy starts ignoring him once more, and instead of just yelling, he hits the boy too. Now the boy starts to hit other people. He hits his sister, he hits other kids at school, and so on. Now exactly what happened here? I mentioned postulates before, and how they succeed, fail, and change in a particular order. And though there are infinite possible postulates, the four most fundamental ones are: to know, to be known, to not know, and to not be known. Let's apply this bit of knowledge to interpret some of what happened with the boy. The boy wanted the frog to be known. He forced his sister to know it. His sister wanted to not know it, so she forced her brother to hide it. Now the boy is postulating that the frog must not be known. But the father came along and wanted to know what the boy had in his hands. So he forced the boy to make the frog known. He exposed the boy's secret. The boy forces something to be known about the father, namely the naughty pictures on his computer. The father then locks his office door, he keeps his phone conversations private, and generally avoids the boy to prevent the boy from knowing any more of his secrets. The boy decides, since the father is withdrawing from him, he'll follow suit and ignore the father altogether. He not knows the father. He postulates that the father must not be known. The father opposes that postulate and overwhelms the boy with a postulate that he must be known by yelling at the boy. The boy is now forced to know the father. This sequence of one postulate overwhelming another, forcing and preventing, and being forced and prevented goes as follows. Forcing to know. Prevented from being known. Preventing from knowing. Forced to be known. Forcing to be known. Prevented from knowing. Preventing from being known. Forced to know. Think about the story I just told you, and you'll see an example of every one of those 8 classes of overwhelm I just mentioned. Much of the games we play are compulsive. No matter what we do, someone is compelled to oppose our postulates, and we are compelled to oppose theirs. Keep that in mind as we continue to review the story. As a reaction to the father yelling at the boy, and the boy being forced to know his father, the boy now acts like the father and forces others to know him. He yells at others. The others don't like being yelled at, so they do things to shut him up until the boy is now prevented from being known. The boy agrees to this business of not being known, and perpetuates it by locking his room door. He goes from being prevented from being known to actively preventing others from knowing him. When his father becomes intolerant of this, he kicks down the boy's door, and the boy is now forced to be known. The boy forces his father to be known when he discovers the liquor. The father withdraws from the boy once more, preventing the boy from knowing him, so the boy ignores the father actively, preventing the father from being known, and the father reacts by forcing the boy to know him by hitting the boy. The boy now forces others to know him by hitting them. Postulates don't always have to be in conflict. They can be in agreement and voluntarily, as in communication. Someone wants to be known, so they say something. The person listens to it, and he knows that person and what he is saying. Then the person listening says something, or in other words, he wants to be known, and the person who originally spoke listens, and he knows him and what he is saying. When the conversation is over, both not know each other and are then not known to each other, and since it's all voluntary, there's nothing upsetting about any of it. When postulates are in agreement, they are said to be complementary. Take notice that it's complementary with an E, meaning that it's something that completes something else, as opposed to complementary with an I, like in paying someone a compliment. To know and to be known complement each other. To not know and to not be known also complement each other. You can complement someone else's postulate by voluntarily agreeing with it, or you can be overwhelmed by another's postulate and forced to agree to it, as in the playing of games. In compulsive games, we call it an overt when you force someone to agree to your postulate. When you are overwhelmed by another's postulate and forced to agree with it, we call that a motivator. Therefore, the 8 classes of overwhelm are a sequence of overts and motivators. Since not all games are compulsive, it's important to note 2 differences between compulsive games and voluntary games. First, in a voluntary game we use the terms win or lose instead of overt and motivator. Also, in a compulsive game, we add the word must to the postulate being made. So instead of to know, to be known, to not know and to not be known, we have must know, must be known, must not know, and must not be known. The word must takes on 2 different meanings depending on whether one is overwhelming another or is overwhelmed. When one is committing the overwhelm, must means I have to and the receiving person can't help but. So if you are forcing to know, then you have to be known. The person you are forcing to know can't help but know you. The postulates are expressed on the chart as must be known and must know. Also note this when one changes their postulate. When one is forced into must not be known, and can't help but not being known, as he moves further down into compulsive games play, he then decides himself that he must not be known or he has to not be known, as in the example of the boy who is sent to his room often and then eventually locks his door and decides for himself that he does not want anyone knowing him. He goes from I can't help it to I have to on that same postulate. There are such things as postulates, which are desires, intentions, goals, purposes, thoughts we have that we wish to come true. Then in life we try and convince others of these postulates, and this can be done with communication, voluntary games play, or by overwhelm as in compulsive games play. And the process of overwhelming and being overwhelmed happens in an exact sequence. Postulate overwhelms end compulsive games, then a new game starts with someone else opposing the postulate one took on because of the overwhelm. When you overwhelm me with a must-be-known postulate, the postulate you drive me into is a must-know postulate. You don't drive me into a must-be-known postulate. The postulate made depends on what viewpoint you are taking. Your must-be-known postulate is what's known as a self-determined postulate. But since you are trying to drive me to a must-know postulate, we call must-know, in this case, your pan-determined postulate. The pan-determined postulate is defined as the postulate you are trying to drive your opponent into as a result of your own. A cop says, "I must know that criminal. That criminal must be known." A performer on stage postulates, "I must be known to the audience. The audience must know me." When the cop catches the criminal, he overwhelms him with his must-know postulate and the criminal must be known. When the performer gets on stage and sings or acts, the audience complements his or her must-be-known postulate with a must-know postulate. And in this case, since the audience came to see the performer willingly, we don't necessarily have to use the word must, at least not as far as the audience is concerned, unless maybe there are those who are compulsive about seeing the performer, or who were forced to attend the show. Understanding postulates, overwhelms, and their sequence only gives us an understanding of half of the postulate failure cycle chart. Because in between overwhelms, there are games. Those are the times when the postulates are in conflict with each other and the matter has not been settled. Someone is playing loud music next door. You knock loudly on their door and they don't answer. You call the police, but the police never come. Finally, you resign yourself to the fact that they aren't going to stop and there is nothing you can do about it, so you go about your day being forced to know the loud music. But before you resigned yourself to the overwhelm, you resisted. You yell at someone. You are asserting a must-be-known postulate at them. Then they react by asserting a must-not-know postulate at you to resist. Then you resist their must-not-know postulate all the way up until you lose to your opponent and are overwhelmed into must-not-be-known. They do something to shut you up that you cannot fight. Then you decide on your own that you don't want to be known. You stop talking altogether. You are now willingly asserting a must-not-be-known postulate on others. You are also making a pan-determined postulate that others not know you. But someone comes along and asks you a question. You resist their must-know postulate and refuse to answer. Then they intensify their must-know postulate and ask you again. Maybe they harass you until you answer. Maybe they successfully threaten you into answering. For whatever reason, you eventually answer their question. Still, before you answered, there was a conflict between your postulate of must not be known and their to know postulate. Those times you resisted someone else's postulate or they resisted yours are the other 8 lines on the postulate failure cycle chart. They are games, and those are some examples of games that occur between overwhelms. Now back to the example of you being forced to answer a question. You started out forcing to know with a must-be-known postulate, then were driven into a must-not-be-known postulate, then you were forced to be known, and are now back in the must-be-known postulate, but this time instead of forcing to be known, you are forced to be known, and the must-be-known postulate is being made by you, but against your will. You have failed to be known, then you have failed in not being known. What do? You turn the tables on your opponent. You now ask him a question and insist he answer it. You are now in the must-know postulate, and you are insisting that he be known. This occurs because your other 2 postulates of must be known and must not be known have failed. You take on your opponent's postulate of must know. This is what we call a valence shift. A valence is an identity assumed in games play. An identity comes and overwhelms you with their postulate, so you assume the identity of the person who overwhelmed you. Another example of a valence shift is the boy whose father yelled at him. By the time his conflict with the father reached that point, all of his postulates were in failure. So what does he do? He forces himself to be known the same way the father did by yelling at others. You can change your postulate to the reverse of what it was, for example, going from must be known to must not be known, or you can change your postulate by taking on the postulate of the opponent, as in a time when you are forced to be known, or exposed, you decide to force your opponent to be known, or expose him. You can have the same postulate you were forced into, but it changes from you postulating it involuntarily to actively enforcing that postulate, as with the boy who is sent to his room, and prevented from being known, who now actively prevents others from knowing him by locking his door. Now you'll notice that the postulate failure chart, though it has all these postulates, overwhelms and games on it that I've talked about, it has them in the reverse order I've given them. That's because the order I've given them to you is the order which they occur on your time track, a time track being the time from birth to the present. In TROM therapy, the overwhelms and the games that occur in between the overwhelms are addressed in the reverse order in which they occur in life. This is because TROM therapy aims to unravel the postulate failure cycle so as to alleviate the trauma and upset caused by this series of compulsive games and overwhelms. Think of it this way. If you get lost going from point A to point B to point C, then the way back would be from point C to point B to point A. So take a look at the very top of the chart where you are being forced to know. You will now see that the next line of the chart is you resisting your opponent's must be known postulate with a must not know postulate. That is what was happening before you were overwhelmed. Try studying the postulate failure cycle chart by making examples of each of these overwhelms and games that occur in between each of these overwhelms. I recommend you either create your own examples or use examples of games and overwhelms you've seen others play and commit on others, as opposed to anything upsetting that you've been intimately a part of, so as not to stir up your past while learning about the postulate failure cycle. Also, it will be easier at first to study the postulate failure cycle chart going from the bottom to the top, because that's the order of how postulate failure occurs in real life, and will match up better with the examples we've given as well as examples that you come up with yourself. You only need use the postulate failure cycle chart going from top to bottom when you are using it as a tool in TROM therapy to address your past upsets. Before we finish here, let's consider the impact of all this talk about postulates, overwhelms, games, and so on. Think about how when a prisoner is released, he will often want to stay in his room all day and go nowhere even though he is now free. Think about how those who were rejected in school eventually ended up purposely keeping themselves alone. Think about how others who have wronged you insist that you have wronged them, whether what they are saying is true or not. When people are overwhelmed by the actions and opinions of others, they carry these things forward into their thinking and behavior. Though it's not the purpose of this video to explain exactly how TROM therapy works, I will tell you now that by my own experience I know it does work, and the upsets caused by these overwhelms and unresolved conflicts can be handled in TROM therapy, by you studying then practicing TROM all by yourself. What I present to you right now is not just some theory. It's how life gets worse. And at the same time, I'm not going to tell you all about a problem without pointing you in a direction to solving it. To get an idea of how this chart is used in TROM therapy, as well as visual examples of how the postulate failure cycle plays out in life, I highly recommend watching the video entitled How Advanced Level TROM Handles Inner Conflicts and Past Overwhelms. Also, if you haven't yet started on your TROM exercises, make the video on how to do level 1 of TROM the next one you watch, so you can enjoy the benefits of TROM therapy right away. There are also audio-only versions of both presentations I've just mentioned if that's your preferred method of learning. Thanks for listening today. I'm Allison Tandri. This has been a presentation of DIY Salvation. Don't just use your mind. Resolve it.